That's why Easter matters, because it's the reason that we can have hope. It's the reason that we can have spiritual life. So let's come back to our story here, guys. Jesus and Mary, they're in the garden together, and she hasn't recognized him, but Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. Here's what I know, that Jesus died and he rose again. And because he did that we can have hope in the middle of grief or turmoil, because death is no longer the end. And when all seemed lost, hope showed up. Jesus showed up. And it's a greater hope than anyone could ever imagine. And in this moment, we see grief transform to rejoicing. Jesus says in verse 17, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Here's what that means. In other words, Jesus is saying, well, don't just stay with me here. You have a job to do. Go and tell the others, because they don't know yet. And so Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord. And then he said, and that he had said these things to her. Here's what Mary did. She declared that she had seen the living Jesus. So Easter is like getting a pillow in the mail. All right, think about it, guys. I had found the pillow that had helped me so much. And when it started to wear out and it wasn't helping as much anymore, I went looking for it, but I couldn't find it. It wasn't there. I kept searching and thought that I was only going to be disappointed and it was never going to be delivered. All of my pillow hope was gone. But then things changed. And when I least expected it, not 3 days later, but 10 months later, my pillow arrived. Hope had returned. Mary had put her hope in Jesus. He meant more to her than anyone else ever had. She spent 3 years following him and ministering to him. She believed that he was the Messiah, the one that God was sending to save the nation of Israel, God's people, and that he was going to be the one that would bring hope to God's people. But then he died, and her hope died with him. But then things changed. And when she least expected it, Jesus showed up, overcoming death and restoring her hope when she had none left. John tells us why he wants us to know this story, why he wants everyone to know what happened with Jesus and Mary. He tells us, John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's the Easter story, guys. The Easter story is the reason that we can always have hope. Now, here's the deal. This is a little bit tricky for us, right? The challenging part of this story is that our minds don't really wrap around the idea of death and life in the same way that the original people hearing this and watching this would have understood. Right? Like if I were to say that you should believe in Jesus so that you may have life, and you don't believe in Jesus, it would be a reasonable thing for you to tell me, I'm already alive. Right? Like, what a ridiculous statement for you to make, Pastor Kyle. I'm already alive. Why would I be motivated to make any changes? But that response is dependent on our understanding of life as solely physical, and that's not what they believed. Death means separation. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew people described death as being cut off, being separated from, not being able to get back in touch with. It didn't mean that you just ceased to exist. It meant that you crossed a line that you couldn't come back from. You were separated. The prophet Isaiah said 700 years before Jesus was born, he predicted his ministry. He predicted the crucifixion and the death of Jesus. Isaiah 53 verse 8 says he was cut off from the land of the living. So when John tells us, my friends, that he writes so that we may have life, he's not only speaking about having physical life. All right? Although there is a really, a very real sense here that if you say, how many people say, I'm a follower of Jesus? Right? If you say, yes, I'm a follower of Jesus, there is a real sense here of John asking us to act on our faith, not just to listen and go to church on holidays, but to be disciple makers and to live differently. But he's also speaking about life in the spiritual sense, not just physical. The idea that we were once disconnected, we were cut off from God because of our sin and our belief in Jesus. But by our belief in Jesus, we can have everlasting life, that the God who made us and knows us and loves us and calls us by name will forgive us of our sin, and we may be reunited and no longer cut off. That's why Easter matters, because it's the reason that we can have hope. It's the reason that we can have spiritual life. I remember being a young adult and somebody asking the question, why does the cross matter? Like, why do Christians make such a big deal about the cross? Because if it's not for the death and the resurrection of Jesus, we have no hope. There's nothing to follow. But we celebrate because the cross is not the end. And so when we have pictures of the cross, often it's pictures of an empty cross. When we think about the tomb, we think about an empty tomb because death was defeated. And yes, we already have physical life, but now we may have spiritual life as well. If you're defeated and doubting, Jesus can bring you victory and sureness. If you are grieving, Jesus can bring you joy in the middle of that. If you're fearful, Jesus can be the source of your courage. If you're a skeptic, Jesus can be the reason that you become convinced.